Podcast Talk.
Learn English naturally.
English for daily life.
You know that feeling when you understand every English word, but the conversation still feels wrong? Like you're saying the right things, but something doesn't click. That's because real daily English isn't about smart sentences. It's about timing, tone, and the small things people never explain. And today, that's exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, and most people don't even realize why conversations feel uncomfortable. They blame their English level, but the real issue is that everyday English is much simpler and much looser than what we learn. People interrupt themselves, change thoughts mid-sentence, and leave ideas unfinished. And that's normal. When learners try to sound perfect, they often sound distant. Real daily English sounds human, not correct.
Exactly. And that's why we call this real daily English. Not advanced English, not perfect English. Just the kind of English people use when they're tired, busy, distracted, or relaxed. The kind you hear at work, at home, or even in short messages to friends. And if this kind of real everyday English is what you want to understand better, make sure you're subscribed to Off Script English. It really helps the channel grow. And leave a comment. Tell us what daily topics you want to hear next. When you understand that this is the real goal, conversations stop feeling like tests and start feeling like moments.
And one of the biggest shifts happens when people stop trying to sound interesting and start sounding honest. In daily English, people don't decorate their thoughts. They say what comes first, then adjust. That's why you hear so many pauses, restarts, and small corrections. It's not insecurity, it's normal thinking out loud. When learners allow themselves to do that too, conversations feel lighter. You don't have to prepare a perfect response. You just need to react to what was actually said. That reaction, even if it's simple, is what keeps real conversations moving.
I notice this a lot with learners who feel stuck at an intermediate level. They know the grammar, they know the words, but conversations still feel tense. And usually the tension comes from control. They're trying to manage the conversation instead of participating in it. Real daily English doesn't need management. It needs presence. When you let go of control, you leave space for the other person. That space is where real connection happens. Why not in perfect sentences, but in shared attention?
And presence is something you can feel immediately. You can tell when someone is really with you in a conversation. Even if their English is simple, they respond at the right moment. They don't rush to fill silence. They allow small gaps to exist. Those gaps aren't empty. They're comfortable. And comfort is what makes daily English sound natural. When learners stop fearing silence and stop rushing their speech, they suddenly sound more fluent without learning anything new.
Another thing people don't realize about daily English is how repetitive it actually is. Native speakers reuse the same simple phrases again and again, not because they lack vocabulary, but because repetition creates comfort. When learners try to sound advanced, they often avoid repeating themselves, and that creates tension. Real conversations don't need variety. They need familiarity. Hearing the same structure or phrase again makes people feel safe, understood, and relaxed. And once that comfort is there, the conversation naturally deepens on its own.
That's true, and it also explains why small responses matter so much. A short, yeah, right, or I get that can carry more meaning than a long explanation. These signals tell the other person that you're with them. Learners sometimes think short responses are lazy, but in daily English, they're essential. They keep the rhythm alive. Without them, conversations feel stiff, like interviews. With them, conversations feel shared even when nothing important is being discussed.
I think this is why many learners feel tired after conversations. They're carrying the whole interaction alone. They feel responsible for every sentence, every reaction, every silence. But real daily English is shared work. You don't need to carry everything. You only need to carry your part. When you let the other person carry theirs, conversations feel lighter and more balanced. And that balance is what people recognize as natural.
And once conversations feel balanced, something important happens. You stop overthinking your English. You're no longer inside your head checking grammar or word choice. You're simply responding. That's when people say, I don't know why, but you sound natural. Um, Not because your English suddenly improved, but because your attention shifted outward. Daily English works best when it's not the main focus of the conversation.
One thing that really changes daily English is when people stop trying to sound ready all the time. In real conversations, no one is fully prepared. People think while they speak. They pause, restart, soften ideas, or change direction mid sentence. Learners often feel pressure to deliver a complete, clean thought, but that pressure makes speech heavy. When you allow your English to be a little unfinished, you sound more present. You don't need to land every sentence perfectly. You just need to stay connected while it's forming.
And staying connected is more important than staying correct. In daily English, people forgive mistakes instantly, but they feel distance immediately. A small grammar error disappears in a second, but a cold or disconnected response stays. Learners often worry about accuracy, but listeners care more about energy and intention. If you're responding with attention, even simple English feels right. That's why native speakers can sound natural with very few words. They're emotionally aligned, not linguistically perfect.
I think this is the point where daily English becomes less intimidating. You realize you're not performing, you're participating, you're not delivering language, you're sharing space with another person. When learners make that shift, conversations slow down in a good way. There's less rush, less pressure, and more room to breathe. And that breathing space is where confidence quietly grows, not from knowing more English, but from feeling comfortable using what you already have.
Another thing that changes how daily English feels is when people stop trying to control how they sound and start paying attention to how the other person reacts. In real conversations, speakers constantly adjust based on small cues: eye contact, short replies, pauses, even silence. Learners often miss these cues because they're focused inward, monitoring their own speech. But when you shift your attention outward, your English naturally adapts. You shorten sentences when the moment is light, slow down when something feels personal, and pause when the other person needs space. That adjustment is what makes speech feel real.
I also notice that daily English sounds more natural when people allow conversations to be a little uneven. Not every moment needs the same energy. Sometimes one person talks more, sometimes less, and that's okay. Learners often try to keep everything balanced all the time, but that creates pressure. Real conversations breathe. They expand and contract naturally. When you let that happen, you stop forcing rhythm and start following it. That's when conversations feel comfortable instead of exhausting.
And when conversations stop feeling exhausting, confidence shows up quietly, not as boldness or speed, but as ease. You don't rush to prove yourself. You don't panic when there's silence. You trust that the conversation will move when it needs to. Learners often think confidence comes from speaking more, but it usually comes from needing to speak less. Daily English feels natural when you're comfortable letting moments pass without filling every gap.
Something else that really shapes daily English is how people handle uncertainty. In real conversations, people don't always know what they want to say next, and they're okay with that. They might hesitate, add a soft, I guess, or change direction halfway through a sentence. Learners often see this as a weakness, but it's actually confidence. It shows you're comfortable enough to think in the moment instead of hiding behind prepared language. When you allow uncertainty, your English becomes flexible instead of rigid.
Yeah, and flexibility is what keeps conversations alive over time. If every sentence is planned, conversations feel predictable. But when people allow space for small surprises, interactions feel real. Daily English is full of tiny shifts, a joke that wasn't planned, a reaction that changes the topic, a pause that opens a new direction. Learners often miss these moments because they're focused on finishing their sentence. But the most natural conversations happen when you're willing to let your sentence go unfinished if something more interesting appears.
I think this is where daily English becomes less about language and more about awareness. You start noticing when energy shifts, yeah, when interest rises or fades, and when it's time to move on. You don't cling to topics just because you prepared them. You follow what feels alive. Learners often feel pressure to use their English, but real conversations aren't practice exercises, they're shared experiences. And when you treat them that way, English becomes part of the moment instead of the focus of it.
And that's usually the moment people say their English suddenly improved. Not because they studied harder, but because they stopped treating conversations as performances. Daily English works best when it's quiet in your head and open between people. When you allow that openness, conversations feel lighter, more natural, and easier to stay in. And that ease is what people respond to most.
There's also something very freeing that happens when you stop measuring conversations by outcomes. In daily English, not every interaction needs a result. You don't need agreement, conclusions, or even clarity. Many conversations exist just to share time. Learners often feel disappointed when nothing happens, but that quiet sameness is actually connection. When you let conversations be light and purposeless, they stop draining you. And once the pressure is gone, your English starts sounding more relaxed without effort.
That's true, and it also explains why daily English often sounds boring from the outside. It's repetitive, predictable, and slow. But that boredom is comfort. People don't use daily English to entertain each other, they use it to stay connected. Learners sometimes chase interesting language, but native speakers chase ease. And ease comes from familiarity, not creativity. When you accept that, you stop trying to impress and start trying to stay present.
I think this is why daily English becomes almost invisible when it works well. You don't notice it because nothing stands out. There are no clever phrases, no dramatic pauses, no moments that feel impressive. Just a steady exchange of small responses, shared reactions, and quiet understanding. Learners often expect English to feel exciting or powerful, but real communication rarely does. It feels familiar, predictable, sometimes even boring. And that's not a weakness, that's stability. That familiarity is what allows people to stay longer in conversations without effort. It's also what allows relationships, even very casual ones, to grow slowly and naturally over time.
And when you stop needing conversation to feel special or meaningful, you become much easier to talk to. People feel that immediately. They don't feel pressure to entertain you or say something smart. Daily English creates low-stakes spaces where nothing important is being judged, and that's exactly why people relax. Learners often underestimate how powerful that is. Being easy to talk to builds trust faster than being impressive. When someone feels comfortable around you, they're more open, more honest, and more willing to stay in the conversation, even if the topic is simple or repetitive.
And over time, that comfort completely changes your relationship with English. You stop chasing fluency as a goal and start building ease as a habit. You no longer ask yourself after every conversation, did I say that right? Instead, you start noticing how the interaction felt. Was it calm? Was it relaxed? Did it flow naturally? Those small moments of ease quietly stack up. And one day you realize that English isn't something you switch on anymore. It's just there, part of how you exist in conversations, not something separate you have to perform.
There's another layer to daily English that people rarely talk about: patience. Not patience with vocabulary, but patience with the moment itself. In real conversations, people don't rush toward meaning. They let it arrive slowly, they repeat things. They circle back. They stay a little longer than necessary. Learners often feel they should move forward quickly as if conversations have checkpoints. But daily English doesn't work like that. It moves in small loops. When you allow those loops to exist, conversations stop feeling forced. They feel lived in. And that patience quietly signals confidence to the other person.
I really like that idea of conversations being lived in because daily English isn't about progress, it's about presence over time. People bond not through clever language, but through shared normality, saying similar things again, reacting in familiar ways, being predictable enough to feel safe. Learners sometimes worry that repeating themselves sounds boring, but repetition is what builds trust. When someone knows what kind of response to expect from you, they relax. And that relaxation is what keeps conversations going longer than any interesting topic ever could.
And once you understand that, daily English stops feeling like something you need to improve constantly. It becomes something you inhabit. You don't search for better phrases. You settle into familiar ones. You don't try to stand out. You try to stay connected. And that shift changes everything. Conversations feel lighter. You feel less tired after speaking. And English starts to feel like a space you belong to, not a skill you have to manage.
I think what surprises many learners is that daily English doesn't reward effort in the way they expect. You can try very hard, prepare a lot, and still feel disconnected. And then one day you relax, say less, react more simply, and suddenly conversations feel better. That moment can feel confusing, but it's actually a sign that you are finally matching how English is used in real life. Daily English responds to ease, not pressure. The less you push, the more it opens.
And that ease changes how people respond to you. They don't feel examined or evaluated. They feel met. Daily English creates a sense of shared ground where nothing needs to be proven. Learners sometimes underestimate how sensitive people are to pressure in conversations. Even small tension can be felt. But when your tone is relaxed and your responses are simple, people stay. Not because you're interesting, but because you're comfortable to be around.
I also think daily English teaches patience with yourself. You stop expecting instant progress. You notice small shifts instead. Less fear, more calm, shorter pauses, softer reactions. These changes don't feel dramatic, but they're real. And over time, they add up to something stable. Daily English grows quietly. It doesn't announce improvement, it simply becomes easier to live in.
And when English becomes something you live in, it stops separating you from people. It stops being a filter between you and the moment. You're no longer translating yourself constantly, you're just there. Daily English doesn't make you sound smarter. It makes you sound closer. And closeness is what real conversations are built on.
So if daily English ever feels simple, quiet, or even a little boring, that's not a sign that something is missing. That's a sign that it's finally working the way it should. Real daily English isn't meant to impress, entertain, or stand out. It's meant to support connection, to make conversations feel safe, familiar, and easy to stay in. When English reaches that point, it stops being something you think about all the time. It becomes part of how you listen, or how you react, and how you share space with other people. And that's a huge shift because once English feels human instead of technical, you don't need to push yourself anymore. You don't need to perform. You don't need to prove anything. If this way of looking at English feels right to you, stay with us here on Off Script English. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and tell us what everyday conversations you want to explore next. We're really glad you're listening and growing with us.